Good evening. With the descending of the group into silence, makes me think we're at a Quaker meeting. But I think we're at the University of Notre Dame, which may have the potential for Quaker meeting somewhere down the road. And maybe one of the first steps is a panel of this nature. Abolitionism, a Christian response to war. There could be no better time in this culture for this kind of in-depth consideration, and there probably could be no better panel than that which has been assembled this evening. We're going to dispense with a lot of formal academic interpretations and introductions, but welcome each of these good professors home, because each of them has had a stint on this campus at the University of Notre Dame. Our first, Professor Edna McDonough, was here between 1978 and 81. Stanley Horowitz, as many of you know, for a longer period of time, 1970 to 84, and Michael Baxter with us currently. We shall begin in that order. Professor McDonough, as you know, is the Professor Emeritus of Moral Theology at Pontifical University in Kildare, Ireland. His work has spanned a number of theoretical and practical concerns, particularly issues of faith and justice and the moral view of violence. His work on survival or salvation in 1994 drew critical acclaim, Faith in Fragments more recently, and now he's working on a book, Free to be Christian, Free to be Catholic. Stanley Horowitz is the Gilbert Rowe Professor of Theological Ethics at the Divinity School at Duke University. His work, too, has spanned not only the Encyclopedia of Bioethics and Theological Reflections, but dramatic interpretations and great contributions in the area of peacemaking and stewardship. Professor Michael Baxter, currently in our own theology department and a member of the Congregation of the Holy Cross here at Notre Dame, has done work in recent years on ends and means questions, writing history in a world without ends, and one of my, at least if you excuse me, I will say editorially, what I think is one of the best and penetrating articles about the recent war in Afghanistan and U.S. Catholic, Is This a Just War? Two Catholic Perspectives on the War in Afghanistan. Michael is currently working on a book called Seeking the Other City, in which he examines Catholic social ethics in the United States. Each of the speakers has a great deal to offer us, as you know, from knowing their own work. Each has agreed very much in the spirit of this audience and the spirit of the question to just limit their remarks to about 15 to 20 minutes so we can have ongoing discussion. And we welcome all of you here this evening and the speakers. Let's begin with Edna.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank Notre Dame and thank Professor David Solomon in particular for inviting me. And God forgive Stanley Horowitz for getting me involved. But abolishing war, a Christian response, I'm not ready for it. Don't suppose you are. But I've had a much longer time to be ready for it. I'm an Irish person, a member of what has been called, I suppose, in song and story on this side of the Atlantic, a member of the Fighting Irish. I know that they have a 4-0 record so far and are taking a weekend truce, but it's out of that kind of background that I come, remembering Chesterton's famous remarks about the race that God made mad, because all their wars were merry and all their songs were sad. He was totally wrong. All our wars were sad, and some of our songs are merry. The ones that are sad have to do with either our wars or the results of them. And they're still not over. Since I began to teach in 1960 in Maynooth, the Pontifical University in County Kildare, to which our chairman referred, we have had 30 years plus of violence and war in Northern Ireland, which spread into the Republic. We have 2 states or statelets in Ireland. The largest number of people killed in Ireland in that war were killed in Dublin by bombing. So from a very early stage in both my student and teaching career, I found myself involved in what I think is the critical, practical struggle of Christians, how you seek justice and how you promote peace. It comes, of course, out of the Beatitudes. And I have never thought of myself, and still don't think of myself, as a pacifist. When I was here at Notre Dame, one of my most illuminating and closest friends was, of course, Stanley. I thought of Stanley as a pacifist. I think he thought of in terribly different categories of me as a kind of liberal. But irrespective of that, these namings are, I think, a mistake. What I have to say to you this evening, and what we have put together in our declaration, is not a pacifist statement. It is a statement born of the struggle in the present world to be a true disciple of Christ in both seeking justice and promoting peace, to be a Beatitudes disciple in that sense. Now, in that period of time, since 1960, when I began to teach, and as you know, in the late 60s, the human rights development began in Northern Ireland. I was drawn into it, partly because of my experience here in the United States. I was teaching in Washington in the time of the Martin Luther King March, We Have a Dream. But going back further into that, I realized that in my tradition, the tradition in a way of a small and oppressed people, justice must come first. But very quickly in my engagement with that, I saw that justice and peace, both for humanity and for Christians, were so inextricably intertwined that to promote one at the expense of the other was to engage in an unnecessary contradiction. Indeed, as I moved into my further reflection and teaching and so on, I realized that the great promise of the kingdom, the messianic promise of shalom, which we inherited from that extraordinary people, God's first love, the Jews, was in fact about a combination of peace and justice, which was best translated as flourishing in communion. That was the messianic promise. In the world in which we live today, there is on the horizon, perhaps for the very first time, the possibility of shalom for the whole human race. It is only a possibility. It is not a possibility that can be realized simply by Jews or by Christians or by Muslims. It is a possibility for the whole human race and a summons for the whole human race. And in my provincial struggles in Ireland, in which I had the experience from time to time of getting into dialogue with both unionist or loyalist or Protestant extremists, depending on the title you wish to use, and with Catholic or nationalist or IRA extremists, and even had occasionally the opportunity to draw them together, it seemed to me that the great difficulty was to find a way through that would do justice to the deprived, and in a different sense, justice to the privileged. In my simple nationalist background in relation to Northern Ireland, the Unionists were clearly the privileged. Nationalists were clearly the deprived. So I suppose it was no surprise in the end that a section of the nationalists took to arms in order to overcome their privations. But as I was drawn into that and realized that the privileged were also deprived, I began to see that we needed a sense of discipleship as Christians that would allow us to be both justice seekers and peace promoters, that would allow us to see what had been abolished in Jesus Christ. That is the violent struggle between human beings, which Paul described so eloquently in the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, that God was in the world, reconciling the world with himself, and that we as Christians were called all to be ambassadors of reconciliation. And like the shalom word, one pursued a little the meaning of reconciliation. The dialassine, the katallassine, which Matthew brings up in chapter 5, and what it meant was really drawing the others, the estranged, together in unity, picked up so marvelously both in the letter to the Ephesians and in the letter to the Galatians. But it was that allowing of the difference, the diversity, the otherness, to be recognized and to be integrated into community which would not suppress difference and otherness, but would turn it into enrichment, would allow it to be mutually enriching. Coming back, of course, to the greatest reconciliation of all, the bringing together of the human and the divine, the incomparably strange and other, and yet reconciled in Jesus Christ. It was that sense that led me to see that the difference and the potential hostility and threat of difference, were in fact the source of our mutual enrichment, of our reconciliatio, our dialassine, our coming together, our shalom. It took a long time. I had other significant experiences in this matter. In the 1970s, I worked for the Catholic bishops in Zimbabwe on the civil war there, and had to come to the conclusion, insofar as there was a just war, then that the justice of the cause of the rebels, then led by one Robert Mugabe, prevailed over the injustice of the establishment led by one Ian Smith. 5 or 6 years exposed to this brought me to two conclusions. One, if there is a doctrine of just war, then the right lies with the rebels. But I did warn the bishops, and all this was subsequently published in a book issued, I'm happy to say, by the Notre Dame University Press, that it's very difficult to believe anymore that the way to promote justice is through arms and violence. That's something of the background which over 40 years now led me over the last 3 or 4 years to say, it's now time not to get engaged in, is this war justified simply, or is that war justified, important as these questions may still be, or to say, am I a just war theorist or a pacifist? I don't believe I'm either. I now believe that this is an opportunity for Christians to give a lead in transcending these categories and in promoting, not just in theory but in practice, the idea that the era of war is over. That's not going to happen tonight or tomorrow, or indeed in my lifetime. But if Christians were to be summoned in pursuit of that goal over the next 10, 20, 30 years, I believe that a new vision for humanity's living together will come about, and that it is very necessary. It's in that spirit that I began to draft a kind of outline of a document which you have in your hands. A fortuitous meeting with Stanley in the spring encouraged me to take it further. His in contacts with David Solomon encouraged both of us to work on a draft which you now have in your hands. It's by no means the last word, but it would be nice if it were the first word for Catholic and Christian theologians, Catholic and Christian believers, that they might share with the whole wider world of belief and unbelief, share with a whole globalizing world. In the globalizing world, the others come closer, and they're going to be either potentially more threatening or potentially more enriching. It's not because of that timing simply that we decided to push forward this document, to offer it to you, and to ask for your response. First of all, in critical appreciation of it, which I hope will happen in the course of our evening. But secondly, not just in terms of theoretical assent or dissent, but in terms of practical engagement, personal, social, political, at home and abroad, with the idea that we can have a world which is both justice-seeking and peacemaking. The old Latin tag, if I remember it correctly, went something like, si pacem vis, para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. It's not a tag that has disappeared from our world, but it might be better adapted today, si pacem vis para justitiam. If you want peace, prepare for justice. Not that one puts one before the other. The seeking of justice is integral to peacemaking. Peacemaking is integral to the seeking of justice. In the figure whom I, in a basic sense, adore, Jesus Christ, and in that other figure whom I so wonderfully admire, Mohandas Gandhi, both took, I believe, as their central thrust that means and ends go together. If you are therefore to seek for peace, you have to use peaceful means. If you seek for justice, you have to seek just means. It's in that spirit that we offer you our appeal, which I will now read to you. As Christians called to serve the Church in differing Christian traditions, we appeal to our Christian sisters and brothers to join a campaign to abolish war as a legitimate means of resolving political conflict between states and within them. Although our appeal is addressed to the Christian community, we believe that many people not part of that community may want to join. This appeal, drawing on the teaching and example of Jesus Christ, wishes to engage all Christians in a serious conversation about the Christian and moral acceptability of war. Indeed, it wishes to draw all concerned human beings into the examination and development of alternatives to war. God has created all for the kingdom of peace and justice. Only in such a comprehensive enterprise can the Peel's final goal of actually abolishing war have any chance of being realized. We hope those committed to upholding the doctrine of just war will join us in examining the case of the abolition of war. The defenders of just war have also a stake in making war unnecessary. To many theologians, this call for the abolition of war will appear presumptuous. Who are these people anyway? To others it may seem theologically flawed and in practice futile. Yet with John Paul's II phrase from Centesimus Annus, war never again, ringing in our ears, and with Tertullian's succinct summary of early church teaching before our eyes, the Lord, in disarming Peter, henceforth disarms every soldier. We face the basic challenge that in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the destructive powers of this world, including war, were radically overcome. It is loyalty to the example and teaching of Jesus Christ which summons Christians to renounce war and to seek with the wider religious and human communities to develop alternatives to protect the innocent, to restrain aggressors, and to overcome injustice. Christian attempts at justifying war from the 4th century onwards have always been intellectually and spiritually vulnerable and politically inconclusive. It is very doubtful if any war during that period satisfied the traditional criteria of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. In more recent times, Christian leaders who still endorse the concept of a just war are finding it increasingly difficult to see how the criteria of last resort, non-combatant immunity, and proportionality could nowadays be met. In current official church documents and theological analyses, there is a discernible unease with the applying of just war theory, and even greater unease with its Christian authenticity. Why do we make this appeal now? We do not think that the horrors of modern war are the primary reason. Neither do we believe that because people are so enlightened today that they will more readily respond. These considerations may be supportive, even persuasive reasons for many people. We call for the end of war now because this time, like all time, is under God's judgment. There is no time like the present or the past. To say again in John Paul II's words, what has already been said by God in Christ, war never again. We have no illusions that our call for the abolition of war will bring an immediate or even quick end to human massacres. So we are phrasing the appeal in terms that invite dialogue and promote serious conversation and analysis among Christian leaders on the Christian roots of this peace project. We hope to involve university faculties in the theological and secular sciences, as well as research institutes, in a better understanding of the causes and consequences of particular wars and in the search for peaceful alternatives. And the results of such work should reveal to a wider and non-Christian public that war is immoral and unnecessary. Such a program calls for energetic and lengthy conversation, the kind of conversation that becomes a process of conversion for all. Conversion of Christians to the anti-war dimension of their own faith, and conversion of others to the peacemaking potential of their fellow human beings. A hard road lies ahead, and one strewn with intellectual, ecclesial, and political obstacles. Yet Christian hope must be that this foolishness of God will confound the worldly wise by persistent witness to peace, by the creative development of peacemaking attitudes and structures, and by achieving non-violent resolutions of particular conflicts. There are encouraging human precedents for the larger hope. It was once assumed that slavery was part of the natural order, and that those calling for its abolition were utopian dreamers. We are well aware that disguised forms of slavery still exist. No one thinks that it can be justified, or no one thinks aloud that it can be justified, but a big profit may be made from it. We know that what we call war will continue in various guises also. But we trust that Christians will no longer be tempted to affirm war's necessity or to seek its justification. Let the 21st century be for war what the 19th century was for slavery, the era of its abolition. May God grant that Christians give the leadership to achieve that. Thank you.
It is true that when Enda and I were at Notre Dame, I probably did think he had lurking liberalism in his soul. But let it here be marked, if Enda is a liberal, so am I. The call for the end of war can reproduce a problem that bedevils all attempts to think about war in a morally serious manner. The problem, quite simply, is whether we know what we're talking about when we call for an end to war. The problem can be illuminated by asking questions like, why do we continue to call a war if it's not a just war? Why do you continue to call war a war if it is not a just war? Or is the kind of war created by the modern nation-state system the same kind of killing that often occurred between peoples and our tribes? Supporters of war seem quite confident that they know what they're talking about when they defend the necessity of war. We are less confident we know what we're talking about when we call for the abolition of war. But it's exactly that kind of confidence characteristic of the normal discourse about war we hope our appeal will call into question. The question whether we know what we're talking about when we talk about war can be illustrated by asking whether it is possible to write a history of war. Such a question may appear to be as odd as whether one believes in the church. One is tempted to say, believe in it, hell, I've seen it. So of course you can write a history of war because it has been done. John Keegan has a book entitled A History of Warfare, so we know it can be done. Yet Keegan's history of warfare only confirms the difficulty of knowing what is meant by war. For example, Keegan criticizes Clausewitz for advancing, quote, a universal theory of war, of what war ought to be, rather than what actually was and has been. Accordingly, Keegan argues that, quote, war is not the continuation of policy by other means, because, quote, war antedates the state, diplomacy, and strategy by many millennia. From Keegan's perspective, war comes close to naming the human condition. He observes, warfare is almost as old as man himself and reaches into the most secret places of the human heart, places where self dissolves rational purpose, where pride reigns, where emotion is paramount, where instinct is king. Man is a political animal, said Aristotle. Clausewitz, a child of Aristotle, went no further than to say the political animal is a war-making animal. Neither dared confront the thought that a man is a thinking animal in whom the intellect directs the urge to hunt and the ability to kill. Yet it is the same John Keegan that observes in his most recent book, War in Our World, that war is a protein activity that unpredictably changes form. War, he observes, is like a disease that exhibits a capacity to mutate and mutates fastest in the face of efforts to control or eliminate it. Therefore, Keegan offers no more determinative description of war than, quote, war is a collective killing for some collective purpose. A description that obviously is intended to give a description of war that is morally neutral. But even a description as bland as that offered by Keegan is not successful in avoiding moral implications. For example, his description seems to make any attempt to distinguish between war and terrorism problematic. Moreover, his claim that warfare is as old as mankind is surely overstated. Why does he not say that violence, not warfare, is the mark of our nature? Keegan is trying to provide an account of war that avoids questions of whether war is a good or bad thing. For Keegan, war just is. For Keegan, war just is. But he fails to see that even the claim that war just is gives a moral status to violence that must be defended. Keegan's reticence to describe or define war, I think, is interesting because it helps make clear that war comes freighted in our speech with normative commitments. Even when we think we're doing no more than describing war, the notion war carries with it, to revert to terms made famous by C.L. Stevenson, a pro or a con attitude. But attitude but names habits in which our speech is embedded that makes description seem inevitable and undeniable. It is the way things are, seem the way things have to be. War, we believe, is such a habit that shapes us to assume even if a war is not a just war, it is still a war, and as such is an activity which, while regrettable, remains a moral necessity. In other words, we continue to think morally that killing in war is somehow different than other forms of killing, but it is by no means clear why we think war can be so distinguished from unjustified. Our people abolish war at least to challenge the assumption that it is obvious that war can easily be distinguished from other forms of unjustified killing. We want to challenge the habits of speech that make war such a normalizing discourse. We want to call into question the assumption made by many that war is often horrible, but we simply have no alternatives in a world as we know it to war. Too many think that as destructive as war may be, war names a necessary practice that we cannot, or perhaps even should not, live without. In short, we seek nothing less than to have our everyday use of war, of the word war, disciplined by how we must learn to speak as Christians. Christians pray for peace. We often say, Christ is our peace. We hear read from the Scripture Sunday after Sunday that Christians are recipients of the peace only God can give. We celebrate the gift of peace in our hymns, which not only call for peace, but may be one of the gifts God has given us to be actually at peace with one another. For we do not sing hymns alone. We sing them together in a manner that anticipates the unity that is ours to share. Such unity is what we Christians have learned to call peace. For example, consider this stanza from hymn 435, O God of Every Nation, from the Methodist hymnal. Keep bright in us the vision of days when war shall cease, when hatred and division give way to love and peace, till dawns the morning glorious when truth and justice reign, and Christ shall rule victorious o'er all the world's domain. I think there is nothing exceptional about this hymn. My assumption is that you can find numerous hymns in every denominational hymnal that would express quite similar views. But if war is assumed by Christians to be morally unproblematic, or even the lesser of two evils, then how can we sing such hymns? To do so, assuming that war may be a good, is to make the Christian desire for peace to be no more than a pious sentiment that does no work. Our appeal to call for an abolition of war is a call for our theology and ethics to catch up with the church's songs and poetry. However, it may well be asked if all the appeal amounts to is a language transforming proposal. We certainly hope it will be more than that, but it is at least a call for us to discipline our speech. Moreover, to call for Christians to re-examine how our speech about war may betray the gospel is no small thing. If the appeal could help Christians speak about war in a manner that does not reproduce the assumption that war is a necessary evil, then a great thing will have been done. At the very least, the burden of proof will be on those who support war as the only means for naming the relations between nations and peoples. Finally, some may hesitate to support the appeal because they assume to sign the appeal would commit them to a pacifist position. But we have carefully worded the appeal to avoid that conclusion. It is our hope that many who have struggled to make the just war tradition relevant in our world will find themselves able to assign the appeal. We understand that many assume war is a good necessary to achieve justice. We have no reason to challenge accounts of just war that justify the justice a just war is alleged to pursue. But we hope the appeal provides the context for exploring how such an understanding of justice, as Aquinas maintained, must be shaped by charity. What does the justice that just war pursues? How is it shaped by charity? Remember, Aquinas said, any virtue that is not shaped and formed by charity will only lead you to perdition. The appeal is first and foremost addressed to Christian theologians and leaders. We assume and hope that non-Christians may have reasons to support the appeal. But we believe Christians, when they are thinking like Christians, will discover they cannot but challenge the assumption that war is one of the necessities of life. When war is so understood, we believe war to be but a name for the powers defeated by the death and resurrection of Jesus. So let us no longer serve such elemental spirits as we're told. Rather, let's be the Church of Jesus Christ.
A call for the abolition of war presented at a conference such as this one is likely to be criticized for being heterodox, doctrinally erroneous, not rooted in the Christian and Catholic tradition. Specifically, it is likely to face the critique of betraying an overly optimistic view of humanity, as if societies, nations, and empires have the capacity to settle their differences without resort to violence. Such a call to abolish war, it might be argued, lacks cognizance of a central Christian doctrine, namely the doctrine of original sin, which clouds the intellect and impairs the will and leads to all manner of unjust aggression and violence. In such a world, Christians bear the moral responsibility, it is argued, to use lethal force in defense of the innocent. which is what is meant by the tragic necessity of war. This critique comes in several variants, but usually they can be traced back, at least in the Western churches, to Ambrose and especially Augustine, who wrote and preached so poignantly about the ineradicability of sin. From these sources have emerged the notion that Christians may go to war so long as it conforms to the traditional definition of a just war, which means that the war must be openly declared by a competent authority with a proper intention as a last resort for the sake of peace, with a probability of success, and without disproportionate destruction. If these conditions do not hold, then the war is unjust, and indeed should not, as Horowitz suggests, even be dignified by the name war. It should be called something else: aggression, mass murder, armed robbery on a grand scale. It is incumbent upon Christians who subscribe to the just war theory to show that this description of just war can be legitimately applied to what nation-states do when they engage in armed conflict. I do not think that it can be done. I am aware that this presents a serious dilemma, for we do, as we all know all too well, live in a dangerous world in which unjust deeds are frequently done. But as Elizabeth Anscombe pointed out in response to Great Britain's decision to go to war against Germany in the fall of 1939, the fact that one nation's deeds are wicked does not make a war against that nation just. Rather, she argued, it is our duty to resist passion and to consider carefully whether all the conditions of a just war are satisfied in this present war, lest we sin against the natural law by participating in it. Now, I am aware that in appealing to Anscombe, I have opted for a particular tradition of just war theory, one based on natural law principles, one that calls for a strict application of those principles, and one that is to be used as a guide not only to policymakers of nation-states, but also, and more importantly, I would argue, as pastoral guidance to actual Christians who themselves must decide whether or not to participate in a given war. Just war theory used in this way functions as a tool for discernment of conscience. If such discernment culminates in the conclusion that the war is unjust, then the Christian must refuse to participate in that war, must conscientiously object to it. The phrase conscientious objection conjures up in people's minds a shallow, sentimental 60s-type progressivism, the kind that imagines sin and evil to be countered by getting everyone to sit down and reason together, or to open their hearts to the idea that we should make love, not war. But the contrary is actually the case, at least within the Catholic Church, out of which my remarks come. The Catholic Church endorses conscientious objection to war because it stands against sin and evil. This is made clear in the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, and here it is important to remember that that council opened a mere 17 years after the Second World War. Most of the participants were European. They were very mindful of the compromises made by the Catholic Church under the Nazi regime. It was not, to say the least, a very inspiring chapter in the Church's history. Bishops wrote pastoral letters declaring their devotion to the fatherland and the Fuhrer. Priests preached homilies calling upon their flocks to do their duty to the nation. Catholic men went off to fight with the full support of the Church, often told that it was a war against godless totalitarianism. There were some who did not join the herd, but these people were so exceptional that afterward their witness only served to condemn the Church's performance in those years. Thus it was in a spirit of repentance that the fathers at the Vatican Council wrote the following, quote, "Any action which deliberately violates just war principles actions is criminal, and blind obedience cannot excuse them for carrying them out." And it was in a spirit of admiration for those who resisted such evil that they added, "We cannot commend too highly the courage of those who openly and fearlessly resist those who issue such orders." The experience of Nazi Germany taught the church that conscientious objection is a staunch refusal to acquiesce in sin, a bold resolve not to cooperate with evil. Specifically, but yet the church's teaching on conscientious objection applies to wars waged not only by the Nazi regime, but also by the United States. Specifically, it applies to World War II, the so-called Good War. Most moral theologians and philosophers, though not all, regard the entry of the United States into World War II to have been just, but at the same time, they judge the obliteration bombing of German and Japanese cities and the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to have been unjust. The latter described by Pope Paul VI as a butchery of untold magnitude. It also applies to the Vietnam War, which in 1971 the U.S. Catholic bishops said had become unjust due to the disproportionate evil it was inflicting upon the Vietnamese people. It also applies to the Gulf War, which many just war theorists challenged on the grounds of last resort, proper intention, and proportionality. It also applies to the present war on terrorism on grounds of last resort and a reasonable chance of success. And it certainly applies to the use by the United States of nuclear weapons in civilian areas, which in its strongest language the Second Vatican Council described as a crime against God and man, meriting firm and unequivocal condemnation. And yet Catholics and other Christians flew carpet-bombing missions over Germany and Japan during World War II, carried out destructive operations in Vietnam, contributed to the most intensive air attack in history in Iraq. And now, right now, as we are gathered here, Catholics and other Christians in the Air Force sit in missile silos, ready to turn the launch key on command. Granted, many of the wartime scenarios I have mentioned can be contested, and good Christian soldiers and scholars can come down on either side of these issues, though not on all of them. But what is troubling is that conscientious objection to war is not even a passing concern to many Christians. The problem is that when it comes to war, Christians, like so many others, pledge their allegiance to their country, right or wrong. They are obedient to the nation state above all else, before the natural law, before divine law, before the words and example of Christ, before conscience. The problem is, in a word, idolatry. The nation state has taken the place of God. This is not an overstatement. As John Paul II recently explained, conscience is nothing less than a witness to God whose voice and judgment penetrates the depth of a person's soul. As such, it can never be totally silenced, but it can be muted or ignored or garbled or distorted by sin. Sin is something we cultivate interiorly, but with the help of our dissatisfied egos and disordered appetites and loves. But this is a process that as always operates externally as well, such that our tendency to sin is reinforced by social, economic, and political forces, including nationalist ideologies. This is why John Paul II, in Veritatis Splendor, an encyclical that defends the notion that some actions are intrinsically evil and therefore may not be justified under any circumstances. This is why, in connection with that argument, he denounces the way in which modern value-free democracies foster ethical relativism, and thus, as he puts it, turn into openly or thinly disguised forms of totalitarianism. This is also why in Evangelium Vitae, a related encyclical, John Paul II decries the tyrant state for arrogating to itself the right to dispose of society's weakest and most defenseless members, from the unborn to the elderly. The Pope's chief concerns here are abortion and euthanasia, which he states must be resisted if necessary by conscientious objection. He writes, "Abortion and euthanasia are crimes which no human law can claim to legitimize. There is no obligation in conscience to obey such laws. Instead, there is a grave and clear obligation to oppose them by conscientious objection. From the very beginning of the Church, the apostolic teaching reminded Christians of their duty to obey legitimately constituted public authorities, but at the same time it firmly warned that we must obey God rather than men. What we can take from the Pope's point is this: as Christians, our life and work in the church, our faithfulness to God, entails being ready, should the circumstances require it, to come forth as conscientious objectors to war, as well as to abortion and euthanasia. By way of clarification, in Catholic teaching, the cases are not identical. The practices of abortion and euthanasia are considered to be evil in themselves or intrinsically evil. But waging war, as we have seen, is not intrinsically evil, in that it is permitted in just war theory. But still, waging war is sometimes evil, and in those cases, the call for conscientious objection is equally urgent, as it is in regard to the practices of abortion and euthanasia. Here we should admit that Christians have not been much different from other Americans. Regarding Catholics, for example, if one reads the bishop's documents or reads articles by theologians, one gets the impression that a minority of Catholics are pacifists, while the rest adhere to the just war tradition. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of Catholics adhere neither to the just war nor to pacifism. Rather, the attitude that they have is that of the blank check. They'll go and fight any war which their leaders instruct them to. The phrase comes from the Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder. Like many Americans, Christians display the blank check attitude, as we shall see in the coming months, I believe. The apostolic witness is forgotten or strangely inverted. We must obey men and women rather than God. This is why the call for the abolition of war may turn out to be important at this time, particularly for Christians in the United States. It has the potential of startling us out of our ritual acceptance of the reckless claims of a war-making state, of an empire. Indeed, it may startle us out of centuries-long acceptance of the dubious notion that the taking of the lives of others is a Christian duty. Dubious because it is so flatly contrary to the teachings of Christ and to the example that Christ himself left us to follow on his way to the cross. On this score, the call for the abolition of war is important because it challenges the teaching of Augustine on war and invites us to reach back beyond Augustine to the earlier church fathers and to Christ himself. While it is true that the teaching and example of Christ have a claim on us in every age, it is particularly fitting that we cleave to Christ's teachings on war and peace now, in an era that so many commentators have described as definitively post-Constantinian. And yet it is not only that, it is a new advent. We need not retreat into some notion that peace is only available for Christians. On the contrary, an effort to abolish war is an effort of turning back to our true nature, which is found in Christ. Thus, in the statement, there is an allusion to the false conception of nature in regard to slavery, revealed as false in the light of Christ working in history. So too the legitimation of war, false in the light of Christ. The abolition of war, true in the light of Christ. Possible in the light of Christ. Are intellects unclouded? Yes, in the light of Christ. Are wills restored to love of God? Yes, in the light of Christ. Christ, our only Lord and our only King. We Christians object to war and call for its abolition are following the voice of God, echoing the words of the ancient prophet, echoed again in this day, for all the nations to hear, nor shall they train for war again. Thank you.
Let me suggest the following process, whether you're in the balcony or down here on the lower level, that you approach the microphone if you have a question. Please keep it a question as best you can. And maybe in light of the number of questions we may have and the lateness of the hour, I would suggest maybe we get 2 or 3 at a time on the table and allow the panelists to choose and to group their responses. The floor is open.
This is a question for all the panelists. I think I would like to see more of a clarification of what war is. There seems to me to be a continuity between a couple of acts. One, you see a fellow murdering his wife and you resist him with arms. 2, you see a fellow murdering a bunch of people and you resist him with arms. 3, you see a bunch of people who are murdering people and you happen to know that they're paid off by a foreign state. 4, you see these people walk across the border, armed, ready to kill your people, and indeed they start shooting at innocent people as soon as they cross, and you resist again with violence. Finally, they come across with tanks. Now, in the last case, the resistance would clearly be a case of participating in war. In the first case, it would clearly be a case of participating in law enforcement, at least if one is, say, a policeman. Now, is the call for conscientious objection to war also a call for conscientious objection to all violent law enforcement activity?
Thank you. To the balcony.
This is an epistemological question. There seems to be this blank check objection to how many Christian Americans have approached the wars that America has engaged in. And the question is, how could the Christian in the military at the time know that somehow the just war criteria were not met? Right? I mean, there's an extent to which the individual Christian American doesn't know all the facts of the case, so how can he engage in the kind of moral deliberation, not trust the legitimate authority, and go to war? That's my question.
Thank you. Third question for this round, upper left in the balcony.
In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and if I remember rightly in St. Augustine, the fact of original sin is used as a justification, or as a grounding for just war theory. And so long as we exist in a fallen world, we'll have to make recourse to force to remedy evils. And this is a call for the abolition of war right now, before the second coming. So as people who believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, as people who believe in the holiness of saints, not holy in their own right, but holy because of participation in the life of God, how can we resolve this difficulty of not being at the second coming yet, but still calling for the abolition of war?
Thank you. Let's give our panelists a second round. Ready.
What a war is, I think we intentionally didn't deal with the distinction between war and police. Just war probably works best for the police function. The police function presupposes that you know what a crime is, that there's a law that regulates what the crime is, that there is that the police and the judicial function are separate functions, and that that therefore the use of force by the police is only that force that is carefully regulated within the legal constraints. I think that as a pacifist, I am more than willing to enter into discussions about what kind of societies we need to enable Christians to be called to the police function, that they can be better, that they can be assured that they will not need to use violence. I'm more than willing to enter into those discussions. What does it mean for economic distribution in your society? That policemen can be called. I mean, I'm very sympathetic with the police in our society. They come from classes just above the criminal classes. We then ask them to engage in some of the complexities of our worst complexities of our society on a daily basis, and then we blame them for becoming hardened. I mean, I think that that is a terrible double bind, someone committed to Christian nonviolence, I'm more than ready to enter into those discussions. I think that war is a very hard, it's very hard to describe it as a police action in that way. I just want to say a word. I've thought a lot. When he raised this, my first concerns were eschatological. Can you call for the end of war before the second coming? And original sin is used as a justification. Well, you've got to be very careful about how you think about original sin used as a justification. My thought experiment on that is, can you think about just adultery? It was the last resort to save this person. It was done with discriminate means. Non-combatant immunity was respected in terms of other people being. The church hasn't felt it necessary to come up with a theory of just adultery. Why did it come up with a theory of just war? On original sin grounds. Now, that's a cheap response, except insofar as it's used. Once you start justifying things on grounds of original sin, there's no end to it. There's no end to it. That's the point. But in terms of, can you think of the end of war before the second coming? Just as you said in your question, Christ is fully present in the body and blood of the Eucharist. If Christ is fully present in the body and blood of the Eucharist, God's peace is fully present. Our failure is not embodying that. So you Catholics that believe in real presence. I'm a Methodist. We believe in real absence. You Catholics that believe in real presence, you've got to think through that in terms of your attitudes toward war.
I might make a couple of comments on. I am always a bit puzzled by the emphasis on original sin as a justification for war. And of course, it was made very powerfully kind of present in the arguments of Reinhold Niebuhr, and the idea that he was the realist, you see, when he left the Fellowship of Reconciliation and so on. And I've no doubt he was a great man and great realist and all the rest of it. People don't, of course, criticize him for being, or admire him for being a Marxist, but they do admire him for being a realist in this sense. It's unrealistic. We're not living in an unredeemed world. We're living in a redeemed world. That's the whole point of our faith in Jesus Christ. So if we live in a redeemed world, it's very proper for us to struggle against just adultery and all the other things that might be invoked in the name of original sin, because we have a redeeming presence of Christ. And I'm nicely taken by Stanley's usually, gifted turn of phrase about Methodists and the real absence, which I don't think is their real view, but it is a Eucharistic matter for Catholics, but it's for all Christians. The turning point is the death and resurrection of Christ. We live in a redeemed world. We're never going to fully realize it, but what we're called to, and this is a call, an appeal, is to overcome these sinful issues. Now, we see that and we accept that in personal terms. This, again, I believe, was a great mistake, by the way, of Reinhold Niebuhr with his kind of book about moral man and immoral society. As persons and societies, we're equally moral and immoral. There isn't, we're equally saved and equally sinful. So it created a false dichotomy due, I believe, to, a wider kind of influences in regard to a certain kind of individualism and a certain kind of excessive notion of individual freedom. But we are both, sinful and graceful. I often think the most useful book I ever wrote was called The Gracing of Society, but nobody took it very seriously. But we are redeemed, and therefore called out of that redemption to embody the justice and freedom and truth and peace of Christ in our world. And the escape into original sin doesn't seem to me to be adequate. We are, so this would be the other point that was made about resistance. Of course, it is difficult, but the defense of the individual in particular circumstances or of whatever, this is not what we are dismissing or disallowing. But what we are calling for, take the great land masses of the world, North America, for example. There has been no war in this great landmass since whenever, 1812 or sometime. 1861. Sorry, Civil War. The war between the states, as they would say down south. But we have to have a police thing, and that's of course, there's been, since 1945, in the whole of Western Europe, there's been no war, which was riddled with war for centuries before. So in some ways, we're looking for, territorial extension of this. But there has to be, of course there has to be, policing. And again, with Stanley, I have great sympathy with the people who are often landed with police. But I think within policing, we'll be looking for, more sophisticated police, crude, armed, but effective policing. But we'll be looking for the rule of law. We'll be looking for courts. All this is part of what we're saying that has to be, in the current phrase, globalized, as it seems to me.
Just a brief response to the gentleman who posed the question about individual soldiers, which I think is a very important one. It seems to me that the church has not really helped individual soldiers in discerning their consciences, but rather has turned over their situations, turned over their lives to the military. What I think a serious call for the abolition of war requires on the part of the church is concrete assistance and discernment in the good old-fashioned moral manual tradition of what is involved in cooperating with evil and when a soldier should refrain from doing so. Soldiers go through a lot of horror and nightmares for years after war. They don't want to talk about them, my father being one of them. We have to learn to talk about these matters so that individual soldiers are as informed as can be. I think this is possible, but it requires a lot of work on the part of the church.
I have three right here as the next that were in line.
This is specifically for you, Michael. You need to clarify for one of the separated brethren here. If I understood you correctly, and I may not have, I don't quite know how to hold together two things that I take you to have said as just descriptions of the Roman Catholic tradition, and so I'm simply asking for a clarification. One thing you said rather near the end was that in Christ there is no further legitimation for war. There were a series of things that you used that formulation for, and one of them was that in Christ there is no further legitimation for war. Earlier, you distinguished the tradition's position on abortion and euthanasia from its position on war, and you granted that there can be such a thing as a just war. Now, what I need help in understanding is how something for which there is no further legitimation in Christ is, at least in some sense, a legitimate part of the tradition.
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems to me, Gil, that precisely because of Augustine's understanding of the tragic necessity of war, that we Catholics have this legacy to deal with and have to take it seriously. And yet the just war principles, as they can be applied in concrete situations in modern times, seem not to be very applicable to the way modern states wage war. Modern states always look better on paper than they do in practice. So that we have an in-principle possibility laid open for the possibility of a just war, but the circumstances and conditions which have to obtain seem to be practically non-existent, not unlike the Pope's position as articulated in Evangelium Vitae with regard to the death penalty. And I suppose we could say in the way the Church revised its understanding of slavery too, by condemning first not slavery in principle, but the modern slave trade, because it was so racialized and driven by economics. So I think it is possible to have this legacy, and for it to be revealed to us in modern circumstances as impractical in the concrete day, and then for that revelation to turn us further back or forward to Christ, and for us to have a much more critical perspective on the entire tradition of just war.
Let's go to 2 or 3 in a row, please.
I had to reform my question after the question about eschatology, but I think I did it. But starting with John the 23rd's Peace on Earth and Gaudium et Spes, and then all the way up to the current Pope, like on social concern and other writings, there's a careful reading shows there's an ambiguity between how an abolition of war will take place. On the one hand, they want it to happen through the UN or similar bodies by what they call men of goodwill. But on the other hand, they point out that true peace can only take place through Christ. So what, in a movement for the abolition of war, how much and what place is, discipleship to Christ and, dare I say, evangelization?
And I guess that kind of ties in with my question. My question is, we've talked about communion here a little bit, and it seems to me that in most churches that Christian churches that have communion, before you take communion, you prepare for it. Specifically in the Catholic Church, you would fast, go to confession, other things like that. If you're going to become a conscientious objector, which I think is a very valid thing, and for several years is something that I've been considering, what kind of preparation do we need as individuals and as larger communities, even as a world, to go through to get to that point where you can take that stand?
Thank you. Third in the balcony.
There was already a question about the noun war. I guess I'd like to ask you about a couple of the verbs in the statement. First, what would count as campaign to abolish war? We know that the First World War was sometimes justified, or at least rationalized, on the grounds that it was a war to end war. Now, maybe that was very naive. It certainly was unsuccessful. But then again, there might be people who would suggest that this campaign would also be naive. So would something like joining a war with the intent of bringing that war to a fruition that would eliminate certain, especially warlike, bellicose, dangerous states, count as joining a campaign to abolish war? And I guess tied to that, the question, what counts as abolishing war? Is it that Christians need to repudiate, or rather need to refuse to participate in war? Is it that they need to get their own governments to repudiate participation in war? Is it that they need to urge all the governments to do that? And if it's something like the latter, that raises obvious questions about what to do in the interim and how to make trade-offs. Is it a good idea for the more peace-loving country to create war in a situation when they know that the more warlike nations are disinclined to do that? Would that be a better situation? Would people be acting more justly and in a more Christian way if they did that?
Thank you. Let's turn to the panel and come back to one last try.
Well, I raised the question of discipleship, and we asked, this was due to, say, enlightened by Christ and power of Christ, and that would be our motive for us. How much it was human effort. But the point of discipleship, as I understand it, is that we look to Christ for enlightenment and for power, but we have to strive ourselves to, in the most intelligent and effective way we know, and try to promote that in our different circumstances and so on. And that's why within our appeal we made it clear that what we were offering might not simply appeal to Christians, but to appeal to a wider audience. And that itself, of course, has a Christian justification, because the heart of Christianity is that God was in Christ saving the world, reconciling the world with himself. So it does, even for people who don't know Christ or follow some other religious commitment, and the Pope, of course, has effectively promoted this in his meetings at Assisi and so on, that there is a call from God which we articulate, understand through Christ, which we feel empowered by Christ to follow, that others, but does demand human engagement, human intelligence, human generosity, human surrender in certain respects. So there isn't, as it were, a simple conflict. Anybody who tries to skip the one or the other in Jesus Christ, either the divine, grace-filled presence in Christ, or the human, of course, ends up in disaster. And that's the Church fought this out over many centuries in maintaining the true humanity and the Trinity of Christ. And in our own efforts and in our own churches, there is the presence of God, and there is the human summons, which is empowered by that presence of God. So I don't feel there is a necessary conflict there. In terms of preparing for conscientious objection, I might leave that to. I should have thanked Professor Mike Baxter, because he came in on this late and very generously offered us his support, Stanley and myself, in taking this, and he developed very well that issue of conscientious objection. But I hinted myself at the very beginning that even to join in this promotion, apart from conscientious objection, which I think is a very particular vocation, an important one, a very significant one, there is a larger movement to which we are calling people, and that is to showing up both the horrors of war and the non-necessity of it. But we only do that by seeking alternatives. To come to the person, what does it mean to join in the campaign? Well, I think it means a lot of different things to different people. In our appeal, we have addressed, first of all, theologians and Christian leaders, but then, opened it up to a wider and we asked them, first of all, to get involved in conversation. We believe the first stage is a serious conversation. I think it was Gil Mailander who made the point earlier today that, the kind of words we use or the kind of conversation we engage in may convey violence and hatred rather than this searching for justice and peacemaking and so on. So it's that kind of opening up. We have to do it at every level in our professional situations, whether as professors or soldiers or parishioners or whatever we might be, so that we're looking to see what does this appeal mean now for us, that we would look towards the abolition of war. And of course, it's not going to disappear. Of course, there will be states who won't cooperate. Of course, there will be interim arrangements to be made. But we're looking forward to, as we're looking forward, say, to the abolition of poverty in the world, we're looking forward to the abolition of war. neither of these going to happen soon, but our best efforts are summoned. They're both, I believe, both the promotion of justice and the promotion of peace and freedom and so on, and therefore they're part of the Christian call.
Thank you.
One of the things that attracted me when Enda proposed this was how it does not in any way call forward Kellogg-Briand pacts, our utopian presumptions about possible outlawing of war on humanistic grounds. Rather, what the appeal is an attempt to challenge the imagination, to discipline our speech and our lives such that we just don't assume that war is one of the normal alternatives among us. And therefore, it assumes at the heart of any Christian commitment to peace is patience. I mean, after all, that's why God hasn't killed us all already. And that what we are calling for is the possibility of us embodying God's patience in a way that we know it will take time. And peace comes by slow work. Indeed, if you're around pacifists, they're terrible people. I mean, you never can get anything done. But that's what that's what we're called to do, and therefore, I oftentimes say Christians are not nonviolent because we believe our nonviolence is a way to rid the world of war. But in a world of war, Christians as faithful followers of Christ cannot imagine being anything other than nonviolent. Now, this is an attempt to call that for a wide range of practices that will help us have what God has done for us, renew our imaginations in a way that Enda and I will be dead before we've even made any headway at all on it. But we've got to start sometime. Christ has abolished war. Let's let the world know. And if the UN happens to come along and gives us some means, let's not. God is great. You never know where God is going to show up. The idea that you might that you might fight a war for peace. There are certain words I can no longer use. It's like it's like screwing to preserve virginity. I don't think it's a particularly wise way to think about it. And indeed, that's exactly the peace that we mean to call into question. Because when too often peace names the order secured by status quo powers that is in their interest. And that's exactly the kind of peace the peace of Christ must challenge. And that's why, quite frankly, the mixture, I just can't imagine. The only peace-loving countries it seems to me, are those who God has given the gift of poverty so they do not have the time to war. That's a hard saying. But for any American to think that America as a country loves peace is to further deception.
A brief word with, I thought, a very interesting question about how to prepare to be a conscientious objector. Prayer and fasting is not a bad start, but a lot of thinking about it is too. There's a little movement here on campus and in some other campuses starting where people who aren't necessarily going to be drafted are nevertheless writing up statements of conscientious objection, filing them with national organizations, and then the hope is to send them to the White House, to the Congress, and elsewhere. If you simply clarify that you're going to follow Jesus' teaching of peace in the plain sense of the way it reads and the way it looks, and you talk about that openly, the one preparation is to be ready to pay a cost for that. But it will be a cost that will be very life-giving, I think. Lead you down a road.
One of the things, just quickly, I say that I hate the word pacifism for all kinds of reasons. One, it sounds like it's a position separate from discipleship. Secondly, it's just so passive. And commitment to nonviolence means you have to be very conflictual because the truth matters. But I say that I'm a pacifist in crowds like this as offhand because I'm a son of a bitch. And I have absolutely no confidence in myself to be able to live what I know Christ has wants me to be. So by creating expectations in you, I hope you will keep me faithful to what I know I should be. That's how you start learning to be a conscientious objector, by having a community that will hold you accountable.
Now, about 13 minutes ago, I said to myself, with the 6 people that are left at the microphones, we might actually be able to do this. And now there are certainly 13 people at the microphone, and we're now at 5 after 9. And principles of justice, along with the gentleman to my left signaling just 3 more questions, suggest that we should go on for a bit longer, but probably not much longer. So I will turn to the patient people, the first 2 here and the first 2 up there, because in my listing they were the 4 that were remaining, and then I think we will need to adjourn and have our questions more privately. Excuse me for closing out those who yet had questions. First 2 here and the first 2 in the upper section.
Thank you for the opportunity, first of all, to consider this very prophetic call and therefore to live more out of our redemption, the redemption that has indeed been offered to all humanity, yet is not fully realized by any means. So 2 points that are very troubling, even as we glimpse perhaps the hope of peace in Ireland, the hope of peace in the Middle East, the hope of peace for all humanity. Tertullian, I believe, is not exactly clear when he says that Christ has disarmed every soldier, because it is precisely Peter, in taking up the sword, who is acting rashly and not in conformity to what obviously God intends. And yet I'm thinking of, for example, the Battle of Lepanto, where the Christian state, if you will, Europe, is indeed without other options than having to defend itself. So we have lost sight of that point, that whether you call it war or not, one is one's right, simply to survive, and if not, then you perish, and all that Christ has done in you and for you, and the hope for redemption of all humanity through the church, can likely perish. Therefore, going back to Professor Horowitz's that brief comment on adultery, that there may perhaps be a foolishness in considering just war because, after all, we can't consider just adultery. Well, there we are clearly talking about something that is prohibited by the Decalogue and is one of those acts that Professor Baxter referred to as being intrinsically evil, never legitimate, versus war as, again, if we define war as self-defense, sometimes being necessary, and only to preserve life for ourselves and those, on whom their existence, those who depend on us to defend them.
Second question. Thank you.
Father Baxter, you started your talk saying that to talk about abolishing war here could seem untheological or like heterodoxy. And I'm young and I'm new to studying theology, so this question may seem too simple, but I seriously ask, why at a gathering of Christians to talk about the culture of life would talking about abolishing war seem like heterodoxy? So maybe those of you on the panel could help me understand that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Can you hold the mic? Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to be pretty closely related to that question, actually, because I think that one of the major tensions that I recognize here is the tension between saying that you hope that those who are defenders of the doctrine of just war will enter into this conversation about abolition and investigate the case, because indeed we have a state making it unnecessary, but also saying that you doubt the Christian authenticity of the doctrine of just war. There's a real tension there in what's being said. For the person who's a defender of the just war theory, it's true that when you're in a situation where a war is justified, the person who defends just war theory also believes that a price has to be paid. And the price that is paid is the unnecessary action of taking a human life, which is otherwise detested and is a tragic necessity in that situation. To what extent, in calling for this abolition of war, and I guess I would open up to all of you, do you see the possibility for still preserving that part of the Christian tradition of, definitely seeing there's a distinction between saying the abolition of war and the abolition of slavery, where the church never had principles of just slavery, where it's a different situation, or certainly the distinction's already been made between adultery and war. How much room do you see for proponents of the just war theory to really say that they are in support of the abolition of war?
Thank you. And our last question.
Yes, I confess myself really baffled by the positions that are being put forth. I hear, first of all, that proponents of just war doctrine are invited to participate. I then hear that we can't even talk about just war. It's a sort of obscenity and words that have no meaning. And then I hear that Christians who are really serious about the true presence just naturally would never think about war as a possibility. When I think of St. Augustine, I can't think of anybody who was more keenly aware of the reality of the real presence. And if we are indeed advising Catholics or other people to form their conscience, they certainly ought to be forming their conscience according to the doctrine of the Church. I think the people who wrote the Catechism, too, are aware of the real presence of Christ. It's appalling to me to hear suggested that we just aren't aware of it if we think there's such a thing as just war. I also think it's amazingly condescending to say that the police are drawn from the next to the criminal classes. I'm amazed. I'm also amazed to find out that most Catholics in America just are really flabby in their formation of conscience about just war and whether we're engaged in particular just wars. Most Catholics I know have serious doubts about bombing at Hiroshima and carpet bombing of Dresden and other cities. They don't feel that impacted the question of whether World War II was a just war, but they do think that those means used were disproportionate means. But I hear coming from you incredible confusion of all these facts into a sort of melange, which, far from helping anybody form their conscience, would just leave them in a kind of muddle.
Well, that ought to keep us till 10 o'clock, so let's begin. Thank you to each of the four for very difficult questions posed at the end. Panelists.
Or do you want to go first, Mark? I'm sorry.
I'm trying to piece these together. You go ahead.
Okay. I'll let Mike handle the heterodox issue. I think you're exactly right that there's a tension in the appeal about just war in terms of at once hoping that just war people will be willing to sign the appeal while at the same time expressing some doubt whether just war as a mode of discourse actually has shaping power for the setting of a policy in our day, which, if you think, I mean, so oftentimes it looks like people think there's a war there, and then you bring the criteria to bear and you have the checks off whether it meets it or not, and you think, well, 4 out of 5 isn't too bad, and so we can participate. I think what the appeal is asking is for, if just war people are going to be very serious, you have to start much sooner than this is a war and does it meet the criteria. But we have to start and ask, what would a foreign policy that is shaped by just war considerations look like? What would military planning shaped by just war considerations look like? What would it mean to train a population to be able to sustain more deaths on the beaches of Japan rather than drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? One of the issues is, I mean, pacifists always look like, and people I suppose committed that might sign the appeal, always look like we're so naive and stupid. When do just war people ever show that they're willing to pay a price for being just war? If you say Hiroshima and Nagasaki were murder, where were the just war people calling for the imprisonment of Harry Truman? If just war people had called for the imprisonment of Harry Truman, you would be seen as naive as those of us committed nonviolence. So the appeal is asking for just war people to be damn serious. It's time, and we're ready to join hands. I mean, as Enda said, I mean, pacifism and just war are abstractions. We're called to be disciples. And it's that call that I think is at the heart of it. But I think it's quite right that that there is a tension, and I don't know what to do about the tension. The issue about real presence was only a response to the eschatological presumption that you live between the times, and so Christ's peace cannot be really present among us. And I only said, if you believe that Christ's peace cannot really be present among us, then what do you do with the fact that it is? That's all. That's all that point was meant to make. What do you do with the fact it is? I mean, we are the people of the second coming. We can, I often refer, I have the Mennonite poster on my door that says, a modest proposal for peace, let the Christians of the world resolve not to kill one another. People get very upset by that because they say Christians shouldn't kill anyone, but the Mennonites call it a modest proposal. What would it mean for we Christians bound together in the unity of the body and blood of Christ? Now, Dick Newhouse is really terrifically clear about these things. Dick says that it is hard to imagine imagined, but nonetheless must be imagined, that two members of the Church of Jesus Christ receive the body and blood of Christ at the same Eucharist and walk across the church and pick up their AK-47s and blow one another away in the name of a political dispute. That's very serious. That's very serious. But then I wonder, what did we do when we passed the peace? What did we do when we passed the peace? When we are able to do that. And that's what we do. That's what we do. So it's an attempt to say, let's try to embody what God has given us through the body and blood. I didn't mean to be disparaging about police by saying that they were often called from classes close to criminal classes. I know that many extraordinarily wonderful people are called to the police function. It does happen to be the case, however, that police operate in this society as a blue line that hides from those of us in the middle and upper middle classes what crime really is. And I think that that is a terrible burden to ask them to bear. And what it would mean for us to be present as people who enjoy the protection that are thereby given us in a way that does not abandon the police to the task that increasingly becomes morally unintelligible for them and the people they're dealing with. I think it's one of the great challenges before this society, and no one says it, is all. And and that's peace. That's peace. That's what we've got to work at.
The notion that a call for the abolition of war might be heterodox was my attempt to address the problem that's presented with the legacy of the just war tradition in our church. I just think that that legacy has been problematized by the onset of total war to such a degree that it has become impractical to call upon nation states to wage war in the way that's set forth in just war theory. And yet the theory is still there, and this theory is rooted strongly in Christian doctrine. And many people who still support the theory of just war, while I would argue in practice support something like total war, would make the claim that to argue for the abolition of war is heterodox. So we're in this time of shifting of the place of the church in the modern nation-state system, and the way that we have a theory now that we don't exactly know what to do with. Not unlike, I think, as I pointed out before, the justification of the death penalty, which has been rendered less pressing, if not practically unnecessary, given the conditions of modern society. The church's theory on war, I believe, is drifting in the same direction, which would be a good thing.
Let me just quickly, one of the issues that needs to be discussed is how do you have a just war in social orders that are no longer committed to thinking that in order to be just, they have to have the acknowledgement of a good that is in common, that is not simply the sum of the interest of the persons that make up the society. Liberal theory is committed, it seems to me, to give an account of how you can secure social cooperation when there is no acknowledgement of a good that is in common, that is not created by the people that want the good, but the good is genuinely prior and needs to be discovered. Now, how you will have a people capable of having the discipline to fight a just war in societies that no longer think there is a good in common other than survival is one of the issues that politically has to be discussed. And I just haven't seen it discussed.
Just to make a few short comments, in terms of the tension, there is no possible Christian position that doesn't involve tension. This was partly raised because we live in a world that's both sinful and redeemed, and we await the final times. So we are always in tension. Secondly, the conversation we're proposing out of our conviction that war ought to be abolished with people who genuinely and fairly believe in just war is a conversation that is being proposed in a whole lot of other areas. The most obvious example for Christians is the interchurch conversation, which we are committed to church unity, and yet we are deeply divided. So these kinds of conversations, they're not simply parallel, but they do involve a great deal of tension. We believe, for example, in regard to conversations about the Eucharist, in the Catholic tradition, that the heart of the matter, is that it is the sacrifice of Calvary and that there is real presence. A lot of other Christians have great difficulties about it, but it doesn't prevent us from entering into serious conversation and doesn't mean that we betray our positions at the moment. This is a conversation over time which demands patience, as Stanley said. And we believe that we need to enter into the conversation. And as Stanley said, the just war people have to be challenged. Those of us who believe in the abolition of war have to be challenged. And we have to really work at it step by step and sacrifice by sacrifice. But because we are getting too, perhaps, pious, and because both Stanley appealed to our transformation by imagination and Mike spoke of the importance of conscientious objection. And because I'm a poor Irishman who loves poetry, I'm going to read a Seamus Heaney poem as a piece of self-indulgence, which is entitled From the Republic of Conscience, which he wrote in honor of Amnesty's 50th anniversary. From the Republic of Conscience. When I landed in the Republic of Conscience, it was so noiseless when the engine stopped, I could hear a curlew high above the runway. At immigration, the clerk was an old man who produced a wallet from his homespun coat and showed me a photograph of my grandfather. The woman in customs asked me to declare the words of our traditional cures and charms to heal dumbness and avert the evil eye. No porters, no interpreter, no carried your own burden, and very soon your symptoms of creeping privilege disappeared. Fog is a dreaded omen there, but lightning spells universal good, and parents hang swaddled infants in trees during thunderstorms. Salt is their precious metal, and seashells are held to the ear during births and funerals, the base of all inks and pigments and seawater. Their sacred symbol is a stylized boat, the sail is an ear, the mast a sloping pen, the hull a mouth shape, the keel an open eye. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office, and to affirm their faith that all life sprang from salt in tears which the sky god wept after he dreamt his solitude was endless. I came back from that frugal republic with my 2 arms the one length. The customs woman having insisted my allowance was myself. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me when I got home to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved. Thank you very much.
It's been a long and fruitful day, and especially an evening. David Solomon has invited all of us to a reception out in the remainder of the building. Please join us.